we have Professor Mary Murphy, who works in the Department of Sociology in Maynooth University. Mary has research interest in gender and social security, globalization and welfare states, the politics of redistribution and power and civil society, and is an active advocate for social justice and gender equality. She was a commissioner on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission from 2013 to 2017, and in 2019 was appointed by President Higgins to the Council of State. And joined with her is Anne Irwin, who is the Joint National Coordinator with Community Work Ireland and has led on their work in tracing the impacts of commissioning on community development and work to address social exclusion. She's been involved in the area of community work for over 25 years and has considerable experience teaching community work with NUI Galway and as a researcher on a range of issues, including community work, domestic violence, and racism. So can I hand over to Mary and Anne?
Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new beards as well. Anne, are you going to slide share?
And I should have said, Mary, just before you start, if people can make sure, now I think most have, just to be on mute, please, yeah.
You go screen the slideshow, please. Can you see that? Are you seeing the screen there?
No, Mary.
No, it came and went there, Mary. It was up for a second, so I'm not sure. Now it's coming up again now.
Okay.
There we are.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, my name is Mary Murphy. I'm in Maynooth University, and we did this research arising out of a number of small pieces of work that both Maynooth University and myself and the Community Work Ireland had been doing, dating back to 2014, on the emerging reality of commissioning and procurement and a concern around civil society about what its likely impact would be. So we got a small amount of funding from IRC under the New Foundations funding, and that really only allowed us to do a very small scoping study whereby we tried to see what the emerging issues might be in a number of sectors in civil society. The sectors that we chose, domestic violence, employment services, housing first, and community development, gave us the opportunity to have a look at the impact of procurement in the type of sectors that were generally already funded by civil society and were generally used to grant funding, and we're having to get used to the idea of new forms of commissioning and procurement. I think that was important. We weren't looking at new sectors that were emerging. It was what the experience of organisations who had previous funding relationships. We first did a literature review before scoping interviews, and that gave us a really important understanding that there was a particular Irish story to be told here, which was different to the American or the English story that we commonly hear about procurement, and that we needed to be mindful at looking at what was happening in other European countries, as well as in more liberal English-speaking welfare states. So we used two kind of conceptual frameworks to think about this. One was a strategic action framework, which often used to try and understand what are the power dynamics and the way people are using their own agency when they find themselves in a new type of emerging market field. So this allowed us to understand how people were contesting, but also how people were shaping the policy as it was coming out in their particular area. Discursive institutionalism drew our attention to how language is really important here, how commissioning and procurement is defined and framed, and who gets to frame it, and what kind of common sense emerges from the framing is very important in understanding how new practices get legitimated and get secured as the new kind of reality. So we use them as background kind of concepts to have a think about what was happening. We had a research symposium where Dr. James Rees from the Open University very helpfully outlined some key international contexts. And then we had 4 focus groups, 1 for each of the areas, and 12 follow-up groups. And we merged the case studies into the census report. And I just want to say from the outset, this research was really hard, okay? It was very hard to do, it was very hard to write it up, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's very hard to read, because it's really trying to get our heads around some very difficult analysis of something that's quite complex. So we would ask you to bear with us, because we are only at the start of trying to understand ourselves what's happening. Just in terms of a backdrop around the legality of procurement, what we are doing in Ireland now is framed by EU regulations, the latest of which is in 2016. We have an Office of Government Procurement from 2014 under the auspices of the Department of Public Expenditure Reform, and procurement is increasingly becoming centralised in that context. There are a number of articles in EU regulations which lead towards a lighter procurement regime for certain services understood as social services of general interest. And there are certain articles that give permission to states to use social clauses and advance social considerations through their procurement practice. So we're particularly interested in that, in the space within which we can maximise the equality and inclusion outcomes. And we are aware through our interviews and through other reading that there is a sense that the Irish state is relatively conservative in its uptake of the possibility of using some of the more progressive aspects of EU regulations. This is very contested in discourse, but we just wanted to say we're aware that's come through the interviews. So the international literature tells us that states do try to develop markets, and quasi-markets we understand as simply markets where the state is the primary purchaser and where profit isn't necessarily the driver of the market. We found in the international literature that sometimes commissioning and procurement is defined as one process, and sometimes it's defined as a separate process. And there's a lot of debate in the international literature actually about the definition of the words. We were really interested in the concept of social marketisation, which is the idea of making markets out of civil society or putting civil society into markets, and we felt maybe that's what was going on. And we were very mindful that Ireland is a very small centralised state. We only have 0.9% of the total procurement market in the whole of the EU. There's mixed capacity in Irish government departments. We have a particular type of political culture. We have very poor local government and poor local autonomy. We're used to the idea of a mixed welfare economy. And in that, we have actually got not only private sector oligarchies, but some of our non-government organisations are actually quite large and dominate service delivery in some sectors, not always historically very well. So this is an issue in Irish context that's important. And there are obviously entry barriers in small local markets. We're aware that some big international companies, even if they're offered to come into Irish markets, may find it's not worth it because the market is too small. So James Rees informs us that commissioning and procurement internationally is actually very hard to research. There's a lot of tensions and contradictions. There's a lot of nuance. There are clear faults, but there may be benefits as well. And it's quite hard, because it's such an ideologically fraught space, it's quite hard to do research in the area and get a real sense of what might be going on. But some of the international findings that are quite consistent are that there are real issues in the state capacity for contract management. So states find it very hard to actually manage procurement. There are very high transaction costs, both for the state, but particularly for civil society actors when they try and engage in procurement. And there are real issues about data, about measurement and about metrics, and trying to define what outcomes are and then monitoring them. The literature also suggests that there are impacts on non-government organisations or civil society organisations. They experience mission drift. They're pulled towards the money and the market. They're often forced to merge, which means less diversity, particularly less smaller organisations. They find they have less independence and autonomy. And there's this process of de-radicalisation where they are advocacy orientated. There's also impact on services documented in the international literature. There's a sense that services are cheaper and that's what motivates it, that they tend to be less holistic and maybe less integrated, that they're funder focused, that there are issues of creaming and parking where services are delivered to those that you're most likely to get the best results for, leaving vulnerable people behind, and that smaller providers really suffer in the context of their niche services, the more vulnerable being left behind too. discursive institutionalism we did, and I have to say this very quickly, but it's actually quite important. So we analysed the government documents that came out over the last decade. There had always been service level agreements in Ireland, and some of them were linked to trying to improve quality in the different sectors. But from 2009, we do see a shift in the discourse where there is an emphasis on cost saving and value for money coming through a lot of Department of Public Expenditure Reform reports, public service reform, commissioning better outcomes. We see also in civil society a contestation back, but different strategies in that contestation. We see some organisations like the Wheel, Community Foundation Ireland, Clan Credo, trying to argue that commissioning should include a really strong focus on societal value. But we see other organisations like Community Work Ireland arguing that this shouldn't happen, that it's an ideological attempt to secure procurement. So we see that the framing of it being contested. But overall, I think we see a packaging of a normative and cognitive ideas, a common sense emerging that this is a sensible way to organise how we organise these services. And what's really important and distinctive in Ireland is that the issue isn't about outsourcing public services. That happens too, but it's a separate process. This issue is about retrospectively applying tendering to things that were previously grant funded in the community and voluntary sector. And by now, what we find is this is a contested area. It's increasingly toxic. There's less and less evidence that the positive social clauses are being brought in, although there's some progression in that area. And we see recent movement of the agenda for commissioning and procurement moving across government departments, and particularly most recently ending up in the Department of Social Protection, Rural and Community Development and the islands. But overall, I think our sense from examining the framing in Ireland is that in Ireland, commissioning and procurement is a kind of euphemism for bringing in competitive tendering. And what's driving that largely, I think, is value for money. There is a lot of language in the framing about new public management type language about innovation, flexibility, efficiency. The public spending code is very clear about having to secure value for money. But the problem in Ireland is there is no description of what value for money is. So people have to make up their own minds and tend to assume the lowest price. And it's not necessarily the lowest price that gives you the best value for money. We also found more subtle drivers, though, that idea of that some commissioning and procurement is indeed driven by the desire for better quality services or better meeting of needs. Some of it is driven by a desire, particularly from the public service, to lower their own transaction costs, both in money and time. So they're interested in achieving merging, tidying up the sector and achieving cohesion because that's easier to manage. There's also some blame avoidance motivation going on there, both political and legal. There's a arm's length management can make sure that you don't get the blame if something goes wrong. And a lot of people name ideology, privatisation, financialisation and power. But whatever's going on, what we did find as well is that there does seem to be a real concern about sustainability, that what this is doing and the shaping that it's doing to community and voluntary sector is having a long-term impact on the diversity and the structure of civil society organisations. Now, I won't dwell on this diagram. This is the strategic action framework analysis where we took each emerging market in employment services, community development, housing first and domestic violence. And we just tried to see what the shape of the market looked like from the point of view of its governance, what kind of policy actors were in the market, what kind of territorial divisions were in it, national, regional or local, who were the challengers, who were the incumbents, and whether there were invaders, people coming in from outside as new actors likely to seek to procure those particular services. And what you can quickly see from the four diagrams is that there is a different dynamic, a different shape to each of those markets, and that each of the markets is unique in its own way, so that the experience of commissioning and procurement is actually quite different in each of these sectors and brings with it its own set of concerns and set of realities. Some is very centralised, some is regional, some is quite local through the local authorities, some has quite an international shaping influence, others is quite national, some there's a lot of political drivers, other there isn't. So I'm not going to go into that now because we don't have time. But just to show you that what we did find was that this was quite a useful framework in trying to understand the dynamics in each sector. What I want to do with the short remaining time I have is just introduce some of the findings and then pass over to Anne, who's going to look at some more of the findings. For me, one of the most interesting findings, and one that we would need to do more research on to really understand better, is that the different procurement processes in different sectors use different price mechanisms. So in some of the sectors, the organisations who are tendering are both outcome takers and price takers. Okay, so they may be an outcome taker in that they will deliver a particular service or a particular outcome. And they may have to be a price taker in that they agree that they will be paid by the result of getting that outcome, and the payment will be agreed from the start. So we call this pay by results. JobPath is a good example of it. And the problem here is that paying by results means that organisations have to upfront the cost of delivering the services and then get paid by the result. Now, there are various ways you can organise that, but generally the organisation tendering needs to be able to be rich enough or have deep enough pockets to be able to front load the cost of delivering and then recoup when they get the results. So this is a particular model of procurement that knocks out a lot of potential bidders who are smaller and less able to have that money up front. It also brings with it relatively high transaction costs for both the organisation bidding and the organisation. There are other types of mechanisms or contracts that are outcome orientated in terms of you are tendering to deliver particular outcomes, but you were paid a set amount for those outcomes. And the big problem there, and SICAP probably would be a good example of that, is that it gives the organisations delivering the services very little flexibility to amend what they see as the emerging needs in their area. And COVID is a really good example there, maybe, where some organisations, they were contracted to deliver particular services that may have been no longer relevant in the context of COVID, but the contracts bind them and restrict their ability maybe to be creative and innovative. The other type of price mechanism that we wanted to draw to your attention is outcome takers and price makers. And this is where the service is specified and the outcomes are specified, but the organisation can name the price at which they believe they can deliver. So they're bidding on cost. And what we found was that there was evidence where this arose, and Housing First was an example, and I have a chart there of what their scoring mechanism might look like, is the degree to which organisations who are bidding on cost end up doing cost bidding simply because that's what they believe is the most competitive route to win the bid. And what that ends up then is they may win the bid, but they win the bid at a low cost bid, and they have to subvent then to deliver the service from their own funding, maybe their charity funding, or they have to deliver poorer quality services or skim around the edges of what they said they would deliver in order to make it deliverable in the cost. So we found this particularly problematic. It relates back to the issue about value for money not being well defined, and government agencies believing that they have to accept the lowest cost bid because that's the value for money bid. And that's contestable, but it's an area that we think there needs to be a lot more work done. And we note in other areas, Brennan has argued under cost bidding should be considered non-compliant in procurement costs. Some of the other things just to draw your attention to before I hand over to Anne is the dynamics that we found in strategic action fields in each of these sectors or quasi-markets. We found that there was a lot of dynamic fluidity. There was a lot of stop-start, there was a lot of uncertainty, there was a lot of confusion. We found that in small states that there is a difficulty in attracting in new market actors to make bids in procurement, but nonetheless some do arrive in. And when they arrive in, they may arrive into one sector, but they begin bidding then in other sectors once they're present in the country. But we also found in a small state that it's possible for non-government organisations to become the monopoly actor or the oligarchic actor, and that they have a lot of power in those markets. And maybe, you know, we didn't research it enough, but that raises questions about how any monopoly actor, whether they're state society or NGO, use their power in a quasi-market. We found that the dynamics within civil society organisations are quite influenced by whether there is a growth area of opportunity whereby if they lose one bid, it's not such a problem because there's a lot of bids that they can bid in. So if they're in a growth period, it's much less problematic. If they lose a bid in a contraction period or in the context of severity or austerity, it's much more severe because it means that they're likely to have to make staff redundant. So the context in which the bidding is happening is quite important in understanding what the impact is. But we did find lack of process transparency. We found huge issues around transaction costs. We found some organisations much more resistant on ideological grounds than others. Some organisations much more fearful about the impact of advocacy, for example, and we did find advocacy curtailment in a lot of service level agreements. And in relation to my last set of findings is in governance. So we were interested in how is this governed? Who governs it? And we did find that and I think we showed earlier, that there is confusion in who is making the decisions and the policy at a national level and at a sector level in this field. We mapped in each of the 4 sectors the degree to which there's a confusion, for example, in the Department of Employment and Social Protection between who's making decisions about contracted services and who's making decisions about the broader policy in which services are contracted for. We found the Housing First czar at a national level. We found confusion there as to how that related to the regional processes. We found Pobal was a key actor in mediating what was happening in SICAP and the local LCDCs. And in domestic violence, we found confusion between regional commissioning processes and how that information was fed up to what would actually be procured through a national process, and the two didn't necessarily meet. We also were interested in who's driving this in the different sectors, and we found the idea of policy entrepreneurship, the idea that there are specific actors who are particularly influential in shaping how the emerging procurement and commissioning happens. So in Pobal, the OECD and EU Peel programme; in the domestic violence, the Institute of Public Care; in employment services, the Institute of Employment Studies; and in Housing First, we saw that the US and European Housing First networks. But we also found key political and civil servants were quite influential. And sometimes one person would be very influential in driving a particular agenda. And we also found that there are local intermediaries. Genio, for example, was an interesting organisation shaping some of what was happening in Housing First. So sorry for going so quickly. And as you see by now, we entered into a much more complex policy area than maybe we'd initially anticipated. And these, I want to remind you, are very much scoping findings. That they're very much just raising what are the research questions rather than concluding. But I want to hand over to Anne now, who's going to take you through the rest of the findings and some recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Mary, for that. And just to acknowledge Mary's recent appointment as Professor of the Department in Maynooth University. I think it's a really good acknowledgement of Mary's achievement and her engagement with policy as well as her academic work. I'm just quickly look at some of the impacts, some more of the impacts that we found doing the research. A little bit about opportunities to learn from international developments, and then some of the recommendations that we are presenting to you for consideration. So just Community Work Ireland, for people who don't know us, we're a membership organisation. We seek to promote and support community work or community development as a means of addressing social inclusion, social exclusion, poverty and inequality. And this is our third, I suppose, piece of engagement or research in relation to the impact of on community work. And we feel that it is a really important thing to explore, and it's a really important thing to keep on the agenda because it does have significant impacts on the way that the work is done. So in terms of what we found with this piece of research, there is no territory varies. So the way the tenders are actually made available quite considerably across the theme that you're looking at, and there's a variety in national, regional and local authority level commissioning, and the regional has no consistency across fields. There's no synergy. In terms of some of the impacts on the community organisations themselves, one of the things that we found is that the skills or resources to respond to tenders are not necessarily within the capacity of many community level organisations. We found that there's a real start-stop impact on the community organisations. So a real gearing up when tendering becomes an issue, when the time to tender becomes an issue, and a time of huge stress for both staff and organisations. The whole element of competition and introducing competition into the whole field of civil society, we found really had quite significant impacts. And this whole thing about who claims the work and, you know, whose logo gets seen on the work has become quite an issue. We found that it really has impacted on collaboration, and impacting on collaboration at a time when we are told that collaboration is ever more important. An impact on solidarity and advocacy, and also in terms of advocacy, we found that it has a kind of a chilling effect, so that there is a fear to advocate in case it has an impact on how your next tender is assessed. In terms of impacts on service users, there are guidelines for quality services, and we feel that is really important. You need to be assured that the service that you are tendering is a quality service. And we found that there is evidence of attempts to protect service users, but there are different levels of impact on service users. In the area of Housing First, for example, the whole issue of below cost tendering does have implications for advocacy, implications for staffing, which might consequently have an impact on the quality and quantity of service delivery. Within SICAP and the impact on community work, what we found was community workers were very challenged to respond to emerging needs. And Mary mentioned COVID there. People found that, you know, they had to persuade their tender holders to let them respond to emerging needs. In terms of domestic violence, it's a very new area in terms of being commissioned, so it's difficult yet to assess the impact on service users, but we do know the impact on the service providers has been less than positive. In terms of public services, the user services are driven by system requirements, reject service linked to profit, and we found evidence of that. Clients don't like engaging with the service that they see is linked to a profit motivation. In terms of impacts on staff, what we see from the international research is that there are significant negative impacts on staff terms and conditions, a race to the bottom in terms of employment conditions, and employment dominated by outputs and targets. And we certainly saw that reflected in our research, that their work was dominated by having to reach the target that was set. We also saw evidence of short-term contracts and redundancies. I think one of the biggest things was the loss of autonomy and the loss of professional control. And staff that we spoke to really felt that. They felt that their professionalism was being undermined. They felt that there was a sort of a generification of the work, where the very skilled work in most cases wasn't really taken into account and wasn't valued. We felt there was a loss of innovation because there was a fear, and there is a fear of innovation. There's a lack of capacity to innovate when you are tied to targets. We did see changes in terms of employment to outcome targets, to wages and to conditions. And there was a link between staff morale, retention and service delivery. As one person said to us, the skilled people just leave because they don't see their skills being valued or even used some of the time. We saw stress and anxiety amongst staff, particularly at times when tendering and retendering were issues for them. And we also found that the ability to write tenders has now become a required competency within the professions. So in terms of our conclusions, and I suppose we would say that we brought a particular perspective to this. And in looking at the research, it is difficult to see the benefits from procurement processes. We were hard pushed to find a real tangible benefit from using procurement as opposed to other processes. And I suppose one of the learnings that we're looking at now is what's happening in other areas. And the future is public is one part of that international work. And their research is showing that public services are more important than ever in the face of climate catastrophe, mounting inequalities and growing political unrest. And that was even before COVID-19 hit the world. and the consequent refocusing on what is determined as critical public services. And I think everybody around this screen has seen that, particularly over the last few months, where what is defined as a critical public service has become highlighted and has become very valued amongst us all, I think. And the Futurist Public would say that resistance to privatisation has turned into a powerful force for change. And their research has shown that where services across the world have been tendered out or commissioned or procured, that now they are starting to be brought back into the public service because the value of tendering is not as people felt it might be. And I suppose just in terms of pinning our own colours to the mast, we as authors are convinced that the market cannot service the needs of those most marginalised. So just to touch on the recommendations, and we've three areas, if you like, three strategies of recommendation. One is to avoid, so it's to avoid procurement and develop absolute alternatives to it. The second is defensive, to mitigate the potential damage to civil society advocacy and services. And the third is offensive, to use mechanisms to enhance positive outcomes in commissioning and procurement. So I'll just go through those very, very quickly. So avoid, so absolute alternatives to procurement. And we feel that there are situations where the model of commissioning and procurement is inappropriate. And in those cases, we feel that no competitive tendering should be used. And we're talking about services and supports targeted at marginalised communities. And we feel that assessment of other mechanisms to achieve goals of efficiency, coherence and value for money, which are all very, they're valuable goals, that other mechanisms should be explored. In terms of defensive, which is about mitigating the negative damage to civil society advocacy and services, because we are where we are, and even if we move towards a new model or commissioning is deemed to be inappropriate for large parts of support work, we are still where we are. So in the immediate or even in the short term, that we're looking at mitigating the negative damage to civil society advocacy and service. So we're talking about, and we're certainly recommending, the elimination of below-cost pricing for all of the reasons that we've already outlined. More use of pre-qualifying conditions to restrict market operators. And at the other end of this spectrum, that is commissioning and procurement, is the whole spectre of privatisation. And I think that most people agree that that is not a good idea. So more use of pre-qualifying conditions to restrict market operators. The use of assessment criteria such as social inclusion, diversity of provision, sustainability of smaller organisations also needs to be taken into account. In terms of offensive strategies, and this is looking at positive outcomes in the context of commissioning and procurement, where procurement has to apply. We're talking about extending the public sector duty, which is a critical duty that is probably not used enough, certainly as of yet, but extending the requirements of the public sector duty to cover services to rights holders delivered through procurement. We're talking about transparency and increased and real transparency, and include the input of service users and deliverers. And we're talking about maintaining and even encouraging the advocacy role of community organisations. So just to finish, just to look, I suppose, very quickly at, Mary has already alluded to it, but the context in which we find ourselves at the moment. And we cannot, obviously, we cannot ignore COVID and what the impact of that will be on all of our work over the coming future. We have a new programme for government, Our Shared Future, and that is really important. We have a number of overarching new national strategies, but one that I would just like to highlight, and Paul did allude to it earlier on, and that is Action 4.3 in our community, sustainable, empowered, inclusive communities. Action 4.3 is to review the current national practice in relation to the commissioning model and develop a model reflecting a collaborative partnership and whole of government ethos and prioritising societal value and community need. That's an absolute critical, I suppose, objective in the context of the work that we are doing at the moment. So just a quick thank you from both myself and Mary to everybody who participated. Just a special thank you to Dr. Michelle Maher, who's on the screen, who was the research assistant to the piece of work, and to all of the others named there on the screen, because they played a very valuable role in relation to the research. Thank you very much.
And thank you to Mary. I don't know if there's such a thing as a virtual round of applause, but look, we are all obviously, there's a lot in that, and just to thank you both, and again, well, sorry, I see the applause coming up now virtually, so thanks to Mary and Anne.